So our next splint that we're going to demonstrate is the radial gutter splint, which generally incorporates the index and middle finger, bypassing the thumb, and then comes up to a few inches before the elbow crease here. The fingers and thumb generally get held in this kind of a position, with the ring and small finger left out of the splint. So what we're going to do is start by applying our stockinette. You just need enough that it is able to fold over on both sides without being too long or too short. Pull this down just a touch. We'll cut a hole for our thumb. And we do want a full range of motion, so make sure you cut a big enough hole. What's tricky about the radial gutter is that we still want the thumb to have a range of motion. So what we're going to need to do is protect the base of this thumb from the rest of the splint, because we're going to end up cutting a hole right into the splint material. So what we have here is a piece of 1-inch stockinette. We're going to cut almost all the way through at one end, which makes somewhat of a bracelet, which we can then slip over the entire hand and feed the thumb in through the tube of the stockinette. That way we have something to pull down across the thumb to protect it, both at the base and a little bit higher on the surface of the thumb from this splint. The splinting material that we're going to use needs to be a little bit wider so that when it folds over it can incorporate at least these first two fingers, but we're always going to do this based on doctor's orders. So if they only want one finger, or if they want 3 fingers incorporated in the radial gutter, you'll pick the size of your fiberglass based on that. For now, we're going to just demonstrate the index and middle finger being incorporated into the splint. So we're going to measure from the distal joint of that longest finger to a few inches shy of the elbow crease. So we'll tear right about there. And then we're going to use a little piece of padding in between the fingers to protect the surfaces of the skin from each other when they're captured in this splint. Tuck that guy there, and then we can pull this stockinette back down, and we'll make sure that this stays nice and covered. We need a pad. I like to start at the base of the thumb and work my way around. This patient may have some form of a boxer's fracture or some other fracture here on the side, or may have some radial fracture or radial inclusion in their injury. So be careful of any extra pain. We don't want to put a whole ton of pressure on the hand. Make sure you fold down. And then we'll pad until we get our 3 layers. Just accordion around the thumb here. Let the padding fan back out over the hand. And since we've gotten to our 3 layers, we can work our way back down the wrist. We want to be careful not to create any wrinkles in the web row, which may create pressure points later on. So once we've gotten to 3 layers on the arm, we'll go ahead and cut our fiberglass. So we know this piece may be a little long, so we use our measuring. So initially we measured from the distal joint of the longest finger in the splint to a few inches distal to the crease of the elbow. So we're going to roll these unfinished ends of fiberglass, the cut ends, into itself. press that material against itself so that we don't have any fiberglass splinters on this outer surface. Same thing on the other cut side. And once we know that we're not going to give our patient any fiberglass splinters, we'll go ahead and test the length of this before we do a final application. So I know that I'm going to be just a touch long here, so we'll take off just a little bit more. Finish our end, same as before. Be sure to pick off any remaining little shards of fiberglass that may be a problem later. Now before we wet this splint, we need to make sure that we cut a hole for the thumb. So we'll double check their length again, that looks good. But we still need to provide room for the thumb to have range of motion on the inside of the splint. So you'll look at where you're going to start your splint, and then where the thumb is in relation to the splinting material. So we know it's about here, and we're going to need to cut a hole accordingly. What I do is fold the splint in half there, and then we're going to cut a big triangle out. This is a little tough, so take your time. Because the splint material is doubled up, it is very thick and somewhat hard to cut through. But once you've gotten most of the way through, you can slowly just trim that inner splinting material away. So what we've got here is a hole in the splinting material, which you'll just stretch, and then we'll need to cut through this last soft padded surface, which you can do on the other side. Good call. So we're not going to cut all the way through. I'm going to cut just a little bit out of the middle. And then if you do almost an X-shaped cut here, you'll be able to use this material to protect from the fiberglass on the other side. So we've got our X. We'll roll this fiberglass in. And then we can bring that outer layer around. And if that isn't enough, I'll take little tufts of Webril. And this is going to be the patient side because this is the thick side. And so we'll just tuck little tufts of Webril around that surface. Make sure that we're not going to give the patient any splinters. So what we've got now, this is the outer side, which is going to face away from the patient, is covered with the Webril. And the inner side, we've got the Webril, but it is nice and flat. It's not going to create any pressure points against the patient. Now this is starting to cure on its own because it's been exposed to the air. So we'll need to go ahead and start our application. I'm going to fold that down around the fingers and start forming our splint to the arm, wrapping the stockinette around the end of each splint, or around each side of the splint. Same with the fingers down here. We want that stockinette to come up and over. And then when you turn the hand, we can see that right now the next two fingers, the ring and small finger, are incorporated in the splint. But we can just go ahead and cut down here on either side. Fold that stockinette away from the fingers so they still have range of motion. And then take these loose stockinette ends and bring it around. Okay. So we've got our splinting material on. This is a little thick here. Feel free to trim it away. Or if it's not overlapping fiberglass, which this isn't, we'll just fold it in. Make sure that everything's nice and even. We'll pull the stockinette over the thumb. And if need be, like this time, we'll trim this down so that it lays flat as much as possible and protects the base of that thumb. So you can use a piece of web roll, again, to hold some of this material on while you gather your bias and get ready to secure the rest of your splint. So around that middle finger, which is where we're incorporating. And then we can grab our bias and start securing the splint. I'm going to anchor down below the thumb here and then come up onto the hand. If you need to, based on the patient's length of fingers, we can cut up this bias just a touch so that it wraps around nice and evenly, and then fold these down so that we don't have any big chunks of bias hanging around. We'll cross over the palm here, being mindful of the range of motion of the thumb, and then we'll finish our bias down the arm. Before this sets up completely, we're going to need to position the fingers in relation to the thumb. So we'll just give that a little piece of tape for now to hold it in place. Most of the time these fingers are going to come down, whereas these fingers will stay out straight, and the thumb will still have that range of motion. The wrist will be slightly cocked up, and then you want to try to prevent as much bunching as possible down at the end here. Most of the time when you're doing a radial gutter, the amount of time that it takes to set this up gives it plenty of time for the moisture in the air to activate this splint. So I don't tend to add water unless this is a young person or someone who can't sit still for long periods of time. So once we're comfortable with the position of the fingers, which is always to our doctor's orders, we're going to want to clean up a little bit, not only around the thumb, but around the back side of these fingers as well. So there's a little overlapping material here, a little bias that we're just going to trim away. We want this patient to be comfortable and have a full range of motion. There's a little extra flap of bias here, which we're going to secure with some tape. And then around the thumb, it's very important that we pull this stockinette that is remaining up and away, and then tape around the edges here to hold that in place and so that they continue to have a full range of motion. So these fingers are down. These fingers have their normal range, and the thumb has their normal range with the wrist cocked slightly up. And that would be, after taping, a completed radial gutter.